So, you must be asking yourself, just how many gods are there? You want to be a pious Roman citizen, so you want to make sure that all the gods are happy. And now you want to know, how many of them are there? Well, the answer is simple. Every single god is out there. Now, let that sink in. Roman religion has this fancy little concept known as syncretism. It essentially boils down to, you see a god, you don't recognize it, you start worshipping it. As long as that god in specific doesn't go against Pax Deorum, everything is free game. And that is true during most of polytheistic Rome. Again, just like last time when we talked about Pax Deorum, it's always going to depend on which time period you're talking about and which region in specific you're talking about. But essentially, generally speaking, for the Roman Empire, for the Hellenistic Roman Empire, I should clarify, syncretism is the act of adopting foreign gods and either introducing them into your religion or associating them with gods you already worship in your religion. And again, this is fundamented by Pax Deorum. If you'd like a reminder on that, you can check our previous video again. But it boils down to essentially the concept that you want every single god to watch over you, and you don't want any of the gods to feel left out. So if you know of a god that exists, you have to make sure that he is happy, and if you find out a new god that exists, you need to start worshipping him and start showing him some respect. Now, this concept, known as syncretism, or if you want to be fancy, you can use the Latin version of the term, which is interpretatio Romana, is essentially that. The Roman interpretation of foreign gods. This is the main mechanism/concept that introduces foreign gods into Roman religion. A very big example that you guys might have already been thinking about are the Greek gods. So, a very common idea that people seem to have is that Roman gods and Greek gods are essentially the same thing, right? Romans don't really have a religion, and they meet the Greeks and then they go, oh yeah, Zeus, let's change his name and call him Jupiter, and now he's a Roman god. No, this is completely wrong and false. Romans already had a lot of gods before meeting the Greeks and before coming into contact with the Greek gods. Jupiter and Zeus are completely different gods, at least in the beginning. Once they start getting mixed with each other, with Interpretatio Romana, we find the line between these gods starts to blur. And so they eventually become the same god, but they don't begin as the same god. And even later on, there are still some small differences, even if it's much harder to tell them apart. Other examples of syncretism and Interpretatio Romana are the introduction of completely new gods into the Roman pantheon. For example, a very, very famous example of this would be the introduction of Eastern gods into the Roman pantheon. Like, for example, Isis. You might not know this, but the Egyptian goddess actually gets worshipped a lot in ancient Rome. In fact, there's a temple to Isis in the Campus Martius, which is essentially the heart of Rome, like the political and religious heart of the very city of Rome. So that just goes to show you just how important it was. Now, the question is, if you have the native gods and you have the introduction of new gods, how the hell are you supposed to keep track of how many gods are there? Well, the answer is simple. You're not. There used to be a whole giant group of people in this very city of Rome whose very job was to keep track of how many gods are there and what their titles are and how to properly show them the respect they deserve. So, since the number of gods varies depending on who you are and where you are and which time period you lived in, I have devised a very simple way for you to understand just which gods the Romans would have really worshipped. Because let's be honest, if the Roman Empire still existed today, they would definitely be worshipping like Japanese gods or Hindu gods and all the other types of gods that they met. Because that is just what Roman religion is. It syncretizes, it interprets in a Roman way, and it worships them in a Roman way. So let's create distinct categories of God that would have been worshipped, so that it's easier to understand both where they come from, how many there are, and why they exist, right? So, as an aside, I'd just like to remind you guys that these categories are completely made up by me, and I promise that if you talk about any of these categories with experts in the field, they're probably going to look at you like you're a crazy person. But, yeah. So the first category would be the native Roman gods. In this category, you would find the obvious gods, like Jupiter, like Minerva, and all the other types of Roman gods. If you can think of a Roman god, and his name is Latin, it's probably native, and it probably falls into this category. If you remember from last time, I described Roman gods as being personified force of nature, like a winds with personality. And this mostly applies to native gods, not the other types of gods, because this idea is mostly Roman Etruscan, and that is why the Greek people have a very different understanding of what a god is and how they act. And this category is the smallest category of gods, because they are native, there's a smaller number of them, they are easier to understand, right? It would be, the god of the river Tiber, or the god of the sky, or the god of the underworld, right? These are the native Roman gods. The second category of god are the ones I like to call the cosmopolitan gods. Not cosmopolitan in the modern sense, mind you, cosmopolitan in the ancient sense, which would mean something like the universal city. These are the gods that are brought into Roman religion when Roman society begins getting into frequent interaction with other cultures and other religions. The most obvious example of this are the ones that you've probably already heard about. Zeus and Jupiter are the same god. They're not, mind you, this is a very common misconception, but it does have its shred of truth in it, because that is a concept that is born out of the Interpretatio Romana. Other gods are, for example, the introduction of Eastern gods into the Roman pantheon, which become very popular during the imperial age. Gods like Isis, for example. Another very famous example is the festival to whom a lot of people incorrectly attribute Christmas to have originated from. The festival of Sol Invictus, right? Sol Invictus is also an Eastern god called Heliogabalus, which gets introduced by a Roman emperor and gains relatively famous. It does reveal the distinguishing characteristic of the cosmopolitan gods, which is that, like the Greek gods, these are gods with distinct personalities and lives, and they are not quite like the native gods. But at the same time, they are like the native gods, because parts of the native gods also becomes cosmopolitan gods. Like, for example, Jupiter, like we just talked about, he gets associated with Zeus, and then over time, the differences between these two gods becomes quite blurred. And so Jupiter becomes essentially a Roman version of Zeus, even if originally he did not start out that way. Because when the Romans met a culture with another god, if they recognized facets of that god in their own gods, they wouldn't just adopt that completely new god, they would interpret that god in a Roman way. A very good example of this is by Tacitus in his book Germania, where he talks about the North German people, and he tells us that their chief god is Mercury. Now, the Germans didn't actually worship Mercury as their chief god, but you know who they did worship as their chief god? Odin, god of secret knowledge, among other things. And what is Mercury a god of, among other things? Secret knowledge. It's not quite a one-to-one, but when you're a Roman person and you hear a German explaining Odin to you, you can kind of imagine that they are simply interpreting Mercury in a different way than you. And so you fold that new information into the Mercury that you already worship. And it is by this way that Roman gods evolve and become new gods, sometimes completely different than the gods they were before. And it is by this way that sometimes even native Roman gods get assimilated into foreign gods, when, the native worship is not quite as defined, while the foreign one is. An example of this is the native Roman underworld god and the Greek underworld god. Nobody knows about Dies Pater, but everyone knows about Hades, right? That is essentially what it boils down to. The third category of god are the ones I like to call the propaganda gods. Now, I know with a name like that, it makes it sound like these are gods that were made up just so that the elites could control the masses. However, okay, so in this category of god, I already included Things like the imperial virtues. You've probably already heard about them. There would be goddesses like Fortuna, Abundantia, and others like that. Essentially, these are created to spread the idea that loyalty to the empire is akin to worshipping these goddesses. And by worshipping these goddesses, you are inviting the concept that which they represent. Now, just like the native gods, the imperial virtues are quite abstract. They are often represented in a human way, but they're not kind of understood in a human way, you know? You don't think of luck as a lady, even if you call her Lady Luck, right? Other type of propaganda gods would be the imperial cult. You know, the divine Augustus, the divine Caesar. They die and they become gods, or so the story goes. Again, these are a category of propaganda gods, but unlike the imperial virtues, they are more personal, they're more like the cosmopolitan gods. They are people with personalities, they are simply divine. Now, despite me calling them propaganda gods, this is mostly just a way to categorize them. This is not quite the same way that people saw them back during the height of their worship, because they were actually genuinely thought as gods. Caesar and Augustus were genuinely worshipped as gods. And in fact, this brings us to the last category of gods that I want to talk about, which are all the gods that cannot be worshipped by Rome. Essentially, these are the gods that go against Pax Deorum. Either they go against the concept of communal worship, essentially that it is the job of the whole community to worship the gods together. Even if you don't personally believe in the gods, you still have to publicly worship them and show them respect, or it goes against the concept of the other gods, disrespecting them and threatening retribution against the society. So these are the two main problems that lead gods, cults, and religions to be persecuted or otherwise vilified by Rome. Because think about it, Christianity, you don't just go out into the streets to worship the Christian god, do you? No, you go to a small building to do it, and in the early stages, you weren't even allowed to go in there unless you were baptized, unless you had gone through a ritual. And this is completely opposite to the entire Roman concept of worship, as well as the fact that Christians are monotheistic, in other words, they worship a single god, disrespecting, by consequence, every single other god in existence. You can see the problems that would start to arise when this little mystery cult becomes big in Rome. There were other political reasons for Christians to be persecuted, but these are the main religious reasons that Romans would give to persecute Christians. Again, these concepts are not as rigid and not as followed by everyone. So over time, they become less important. People start worshipping the more popular gods. Eventually, even the Christian god stops being persecuted and becomes accepted into general society until, as we all know, it eventually gets adopted by the empire. So again, to summarize, how many gods are there? The answer is, there are all of them. Because as you now know, as long as you give them a fancy Latin name, you can worship just about any god you'd like and call yourself Roman.